Welcome back to another episode of the Inside Japan podcast. I'm Charlie, and as always, this podcast is sponsored by JobsinJapan.com, which is the best place on the internet to find your next job in Japan. Today, I'm talking with Peter Galante, who is the co-founder of Innovative Language, and he is a founder of the Jpod101 podcast. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Charlie. How are you? And thank you for having me on the show. And thank you for everyone who's listening.
Tell me a little bit about why you started Japanese Pod 101.
All right. That is a great question. Maybe I can give a quick background of how I even got there. We started Japanese Pod 101 in 2005, but I originally came to Japan in 1998 as an English conversation teacher. I spent 2 years teaching and going to Japanese school at the same time, which was a bit of a crazy schedule. And after that, I wound up, I first came and I was in Ibaraki Prefecture. Then I came to Tokyo as a graduate school student at a Japanese university and actually studying in Japanese. Most people do a master's in 2 years at a Japanese university. It only took me 3 years to get my master's before getting into a PhD program in economics. And during my PhD program, I founded Japanese Pod 101 and then later on co-founded InnovativeLanguage.com. So quick background.
So what are some easy, basic ways to learn Japanese?
So for context, Charlie and I were speaking a bit before the podcast, and we both did the community center Japanese, which is super affordable and super nice. But the people there tend to skew towards the older side, mature.
Yeah. Yes, right, exactly.
So I kind of wound up my first core group of friends in Japan were 70-year-old women. So we had, again, the language commonality, speaking Japanese, but the deeper levels of connection were a little out of line. So when you're studying a language, the more connections you have, whether it's relationships, whether it's business, whether it's coffee, more relationships and more things you can forge, these points of commonality, I think the better odds you have of actually getting to whatever goal you want to achieve, right?
Right.
And it's one of the things I kind of talk about on the podcast, like how you can we call them.
Is it like a term of art?
It's total blank here, but I'll get that word. But the more connections you create, it's kind of think of like a spider web. The stronger your bond or the stronger your motivation will stay, right?
Yeah, and I think especially in Japan, a lot of people and I hear the same thing from a lot of different people. They'll say, I really want to make some Japanese friends, and especially for guys, I want to make some Japanese guy friends so that when I'm speaking Japanese, I'm not just learning it from, girls I've been dating or like the children I've been teaching, which is what happens with a lot of teachers in Japan. But instead, kind of making friends with guys and you have common interests. So a lot of things I recommend is like finding a sports team or something to do with sports. Like I had this great basketball group in Nagoya. I used to go every week, and it wasn't as much talking, but we did communicate a lot after the basketball session was over. And I had a lot of friends there that I actually really just got along with really well. And it's something that you can do to bond, because guys tend not to bond in the same way as girls do, I think, especially in Japan, where it seems like the gender differences are a little bit more pronounced in Japan. Like guys will hang out with other guys and the girls will hang out with other girls, and the kind of things that guys might be more interested in, doing an activity, like we'll meet together to play sports or something. And so one of the ways actually for me that was great was I quite liked video games, and we'd play online video games together. So I'd never like Zoom chat with my guy friends in Japan, but we play some video games together, and that would be kind of like the social lubricant for us to actually discuss something and get together and talk.
Well, I think let's back up a minute here. Charlie, let me ask you a question. How many friends in the world do you have? 4, 5?
That's a great question. I probably have like a good half dozen or so, but like close friends, people who I actually spend a lot of time with, I'm always in touch with, and they know what's going on in my life.
So, right, you have to set the frame of context, right? So most people like, yeah, I want to get a bunch of friends, but we only have quite a few friends in our lives. So exactly what you're saying, there's interactions, there's connections, and most people are like, yeah, I want to get there, but it's incremental steps. And maybe even a better starting point is a local shop you visit where there's a commercial element to it, right? Where you're going into the coffee shop. Again, we're back to the coffee,
Right.
but or you're going into an izakaya or a place where someone's running a restaurant, and you kind of visit. And
like
every
becoming a
Monday you kind of,
regular, right? Like becoming a regular. And that's actually something that people I think used to do a lot more than they do now. And you used to have like regulars at, and I guess like in England, you know, you'd be like a regular at a local pub or something, or you'd have like the place you go pick up your newspaper in the morning. But a lot of that stuff has kind of gone online, and especially during COVID, it's been really hard to do. But there are still places that I frequent all the time, and I know the people there, and I always chat with them, especially the coffee places where, you know, I'm into coffee, but you know, whatever it is that you're into, like finding a place where you can go in and actually talk to the person about whatever product it is because you're interested in that product. It's a great way to get to actually know people.
Yeah, and those are the levels. And I think sports is an excellent one. I've had a lot of success doing sports. And if we talk a little bit about my journey here in Japan,
yeah, I do really want to know about that, like how you actually built your language learning experience, because you started Japanese Pod 101, and so obviously everyone's going to be thinking, okay, that you have a good understanding of how to learn Japanese, and you've shared that with a lot of people. So yeah, tell me a little bit about like your language learning experience. Like, what was it like? Did you come to Japan knowing some Japanese already, having studied, or was it from zero like it was for me?
So it wasn't from zero, but before I came to Japan, and we're talking 1998. So before I came to Japan, I actually invested heavily in kanji. I'm a firm believer that if you can read, it gives you quite an advantage because you can immerse yourself constantly. If you're on the train, you can immerse things, and it gives you access to, you know, one of the best ways to learn. I have a son, one of my sons, and he figured out the secret to learning. If you talk to him, or a teacher talks to him, and the teacher finishes or I finish, he's one of the few who will actually raise his hand and say, "Excuse me, I had no idea what you just said," or "Excuse me, can you back up and tell me what that meant?" Because a lot of times we just kind of nod our way through, but that ability to use the resources around you, whether it's something written or a human, that ability is incredible. So one of the most powerful ways I learn is if I'm looking, I remember being on a train and looking at a kanji, looking at a sentence I couldn't read, and I would say to the guy next to me, "Excuse me, can you help me read that?"
Oh, wow. I would
And
never want to do that on a train in Tokyo because people just look at you like you're a crazy person.
you know, but what you just did there is you're not wrong, but you have to go to what percent of the time you're not wrong. Because for every 10 interactions, 3 times someone's like, this guy's nuts. But the other 7, they're like, "Oh, sure, this is how you read this. If you need anything else, just give me a tap. Oh, thank you so much. It's so nice to meet kind people like you in Tokyo. Oh, no worries, where are you from?" And all of a sudden, before you know it, my ride is spent talking and getting to know someone, immersed in the language. And that's 30 minutes more than the other person sitting and learning by themselves. So that ability to apply what you learn, right? Applied linguistics, like that is the ultimate key to when you go back to the sports, right? When you brought up that sports reference, when you join the sports, most of the sports is in the language. Afterwards, you're talking in the language. So what's nice about that is you have the opportunity to use the language. But what if you can create that every day in every interaction? "Hey, excuse me, I'd like a coffee. Which do you recommend?" "Oh, so this one's better. Why is it better?" "Oh, okay, the beans are darker. Yeah, I think I like dark beans." And when you ask someone, all of a sudden they're vested in whether you like it or not. So when you're done, "Hey, how was it?" And your interaction increases tenfold. It's like a return
Right.
on your time investment.
And especially as a visible foreigner, that people, they'll see you and they'll be more invested in trying to get you to understand the thing that they're making, because they want to make a good impression on foreigners. Like, it's one of the things that Japanese people always want to do, is they always, and I noticed this as soon as I came to Japan. Actually, in one of my first weeks here, we went to this yakitori place, and there were a whole bunch of people there who they kept on buying us stuff and saying like, hey, have you tried this one? What do you think of this one? And we try it and be like, whoa, I've never had anything like that before. Because there'll be things in there like chicken heart and things like that we don't usually eat in the West, and they know that, and so they're just looking to have a reaction, and for them it's worth it to kind of like pay for something for you to kind of experience that interaction with a foreigner that they've probably have very little opportunity to experience. So I think that's a really that's a good way to do it. And especially in Tokyo, I find myself from day to day often not, it's weird because I live in Japan, but the kind of opportunities I have to speak Japanese might seem limited, because all I'm doing is going into the convenience store and saying, oh, reiji bukuro iranai desu, or something like that. And that's really all the Japanese that I might use in a day if I'm not looking for those opportunities to actually ask a question or talk to somebody.
What you just described is the number one thing holding people back. And it's nothing to do with location. When you're in a big city, and a lot of people are here to make money, and the reason they want to make money is to provide for their family. So a lot of people are interested in kind of maximizing their time here, and that's okay. That's part of the things. And what happens is, if you have a few bad experiences and you kind of get caught in a routine, then it's really hard to retrain your brain to kind of go out and look for the most, like to take 5 minutes to talk to a security guard in your building, to take the 5 minutes to, talk to the taxi driver rather than, scroll your phone or make a multitask and do a phone call, right? We're all busy, and, the cell phone is arguably can make you productive, but it can also be a great hindrance. You have instant access to everything you want back home, instant access to friends, family, Netflix. Let's talk about Netflix in a bit. But so you really have to apply yourself to create these routines that give you powerful return on your investment, which is studying a language. Because for every hour, for every 30 minutes you're speaking, a good rule is about, if it's an hour you're speaking in a conversation class or with someone else, you kind of want to study about 3 hours to make the most of it, right? So that's where if we go back to the convenience store, if you go into a convenience store and you spend 30 minutes studying what you want to say to the person working there, you can make it a meaningful exchange, right? Like, you can say something like, and it depends on the person, like the person in their mood and how busy they are. So you always have to be aware of this. But if you pick your time when it's not so busy, maybe 10 at night, you go in, they might even want to be a little chatty, but you have to prepare. Go in, oh, wow, pretty late. You guys, can I buy alcohol? Because, right now I can't buy alcohol outside. The guy's like, well, yeah, of course you can buy alcohol. Oh, sorry, I didn't know. I didn't think. What do you guys sound a lot of? If you write all that down, then all of a sudden he gets to know you. You repeat, rinse, wash, repeat. And then before you know it, every time you go in, you're a 5-10 minute exchange.
Right, exactly. And I mean, it seems like people really struggle with Japanese specifically, because I mean, my sister lived in Switzerland for a year, and she came back speaking fluent French, and it wasn't a problem for her. Like, she had some French speaking friends. She went to like classes like once a week. But I've known people in Japan who have been here for decades, and they've maybe learned, the basics of what they need to get by on a day-to-day basis, but they couldn't have a conversation about anything complicated or anything about anything really, just the most basic of things like counting and ordering food. So why do you think it's really hard for people to actually learn Japanese specifically? Because I think it's a lot more than just how difficult the language is, with the writing structure being different. I think it's a lot more complicated than just that.
Well, yeah, but I prefer to look at it like this, right? In life, everyone has goals, right? Certain goals are a lot harder than, I want to win a Nobel Peace Prize. That's like probably multiple times harder than learning Japanese. So there are these you can kind of rank your goals, right? Wake up at 7 a.m. is probably not relatively hard, depending on your schedule. So let's bucket learning Japanese as a harder goal. And a lot of times, though, this comes down to expectations. You can take a look at any goal you have in your life. Financial is kind of an easy one. I want to have X amount of money in the bank by X time, or working out is another good one. It's like, I want to be in great shape by the summer. I'm 45. I'm 0 for 45 at looking good at the beach. But don't worry, next year is the year, right? So if we work backwards from this, so I think people are like, I'm going to learn Japanese. And they set that goal, and it's very ambiguous. It's like, well, what is learning Japanese? So you have to kind of deconstruct the goal. So weight's a good one. It's like, I want to lose 5 kilos, 5 pounds, a stone. Actually, I don't know if that worked out for the British listeners, but you kind of get the point. So if you deconstruct your goals, like I want to learn 50 words, I want to learn 50 kanji, then all of a sudden you can approach it and you can say, it's not that I failed or I succeeded at learning Japanese, but I succeeded at learning a certain amount of kanji. Each goal you get should motivate you more to go further. Secondly, so one, it's about how you create your goals and how you structure them. So you kind of have to work backwards and deconstruct the goal. Number two, it's the routine. So I think in my case, actually my wife is not Japanese. My wife is Chinese. But a lot of times relationships, the context gets set. So if your partner and you wind up speaking in English, you're never, ever going to change that context. So, the idea that one day my wife will teach me Japanese or that my partner will teach me Japanese, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So you have to you have to abandon that, accept, abandon, and move on, and create a new routine where you hire a tutor, you get a language exchange partner, you use a program such as Jpod101, you learn on YouTube, you learn on Netflix, and you create the time in your schedule to actually learn. And it's basic. It's not so much learn Japanese, but it's basic goal things like this. And it goes back to that motivation, the more connections. And now I got the word, it's called anchor points. The more anchor points you can connect to a language, the more it's going to be. And if you're here in Japan, you have these anchor points around you. It's how do you create them and how do you stick with them? And I often say that you should even start not by carving out time, because you'll never carve the time out of your schedule. You start by multitasking. So if you're commuting to work, you're listening and commuting. You're still commuting to work, but you're multitasking. And if you can successfully multitask for a month or 2 months, then you're ready to carve out time. But most people it's like, I'm going to study 3 hours a week. You're not going to carve out 3 hours out of your set routines. It's almost, the probability is less than 0.001% that you can actually find that time.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the conversation, and I just want to take a quick moment to mention that this podcast is only possible because of the support of JobsinJapan.com. So next time you're looking for a job, check out JobsinJapan.com. There are tons of jobs on there, not only in English teaching, but also software engineering, hospitality, marketing and consulting, among many others. Most of the jobs on the board do not require any specific level of Japanese, and you can get started in minutes. So next time you're looking for a job, check out JobsinJapan.com, and let's get back to the conversation. You have to kind of trick your brain into actually finding the time, while you're on your commute or something. And actually that was kind of a big a pivot point for me when I was learning Japanese, because I was trying to study by myself when I lived out in the countryside my first few months in Japan. And I was just like, I can't make heads or tails of this. This is really difficult. And what really helped was actually, and it sounds strange now because I can't stand their programs anymore, but there was a Pimsleur audio program. And I think Pimsleur is a little bit too repetitive. It gets very boring very quickly. But I had this 50-minute bus journey to my school. And there was one school that I had to do that, twice a week or something. And so I was like, okay, both of those days, I've got 50 minutes. I'm going to listen to like a whole, part of the Pimsleur tape. And I would listen to it and I would pick up a few things. And then I go and try them at the darts bar later, the darts bar where I met most of my guy friends. And like you said, having that place where you can go and you're part of like the community, there's and in a commercial exchange, like the owner of the dance bar was a super nice guy, and so we'd like chat all the time, and I'd like use my new Japanese that I learned from listening to the Pimsleur that day. And so I end up speaking a lot more Japanese and listening to a lot more Japanese and having it be a bigger part of my life without having to like sit down and get a book and like read through it and be like, oh yes, I'm studying. You know, I actually just kind of absorbed it through osmosis.
Okay, you touched on three great points. First, the medium. For you, Pimsleur was successful. People love Pimsleur. Other people don't like it. But it's not that it's good or bad. It's what's the best fit for you at a certain point of time in your life, connected with your environment, right? Pimsleur is ideal for a bus, you know, listening, and that what is that right medium? And then that's a very personal choice. You know, I personally find, you know, flashcards, handwritten flashcards, you know, still useful. I mean, and someone will tell you, well, that's not the right way to do it. But, you know, whatever works for you, that's the number one thing. Okay. Second, it's exactly what we kind of spoke about, that you would learn a bit, then go to the bar, use the Pimsleur, and then let me go out on a limb here and say that the guys are like, I don't know where you learned that, but this is how we say it.
Right. That happened all the time. And especially in Fukuoka, where I was living, because they have their way of saying things. And so I would say it in the sort of hyojungo, the like normal Japanese way of saying it. And they'd be like, don't say it like that. That sounds kind of like, you know, feminine or something. And then they, especially the guys in Fukuoka, are super like, the way they speak Japanese is much more masculine than here in Tokyo. And so they would be like, no, don't say it like that. Like say it like this, like copy. And they'd actually like help me say those kinds of things in a more masculine way, which is really helpful, especially for a lot of foreigners in Japan. Like I said, they're all learning from their girlfriends and their students they're teaching, and they're not learning from other men. So you get a lot of very feminine sounding guys, and that can be a really big deal once you get into business in Japan. If you start doing business in a city like Tokyo, if you speak in a stereotypically feminine way, it's very difficult to be taken seriously.
Let's quickly touch on that point, and then I'll go back and finish my final thread.
Right.
If I can pull it out. So, you know, I think I have a lot of kind of interest in this, and you know, feminine voices are actually, like, you know, in some ways they're easier to pick up on. So I think that's why, and for some reason, many Japanese teachers, when you're first exposed, tend to be female. So you're kind of mimicking in some ways a lot of what you can hear, and the way of speaking is much clearer. So there are these you know, stages that you kind of go through, and I think you experienced very similar to me, that early on my spoken Japanese was kind of slightly on the feminine side of things, and it took quite some, I don't even know if I fixed it per se, but you know, it just takes time. You go through these stages. It's been, I believe, a lot of research done on how young children learn, and that's why they'll actually use feminine voices, because, you know, young children kind of identify with them a little clearer. So, but if we go back and we have that first component, that, you know, whatever works for you, go with that. You know. There's no right or wrong. It comes down to a very personal decision on how you want to learn. When we started Jpod 101, I kind of put a lot of emphasis on making it entertaining, because I felt like we had to kind of battle with people's time. So we wanted to make it interesting for them to say, oh, I wonder what happened with that story, or things like this. So that was kind of one approach we took. But whatever works for you, that's what you should do. Number two, you learn, then apply, learn, then apply. And, you know, it's called this memory recall, this taking what you learned out of your brain. That action is one of the most powerful ways to learn. So anytime you're doing that, there's something I call like 50% input, 50% output. Ideally, like if you spend an hour learning, then you do an hour of using. The best way to illustrate this is, you know, Charlie, how much Netflix do you watch a day?
0. I don't have Netflix anymore. I deleted it because it was taking up so much of my time.
Okay, so you had it at one point.
Right.
When you had it, for every hour you watched, how much time did you sit down and write a review? This story was great. How much output
Zero. And I'd forget a lot of, and I do that a lot actually. I listen to a lot of podcasts. That's my favorite thing. And it's a lot of psychology podcasts and things like that. And I it's funny because I forget a lot of what I've heard. And I think it's because just listening to something, you probably remember, maybe 5% or less, of what you're actually listening to, unless you sit down and then you write some of the stuff that you heard and some of the lessons you learned. Then it goes up to maybe like 10% or 15%. And then if you watch the person doing a talk where they're talking about the same thing, it's learning from all of these different ways and then applying it yourself. That's when you start to actually get to a level where you're picking up a lot of what you do. But if you're like me, listening to an hour or two of podcasts a day, you're not, I can't remember like 90% of what I've listened to, more than 90%, 99% of what I've listened to in the last month, just because I'm always listening to something.
Yeah. And this is a great conversation. So I think potential Japanese learners out there can get a lot from it. And you have that learning, that application, you're pulling it out. You're going to the bar and using it. And if you go back to Netflix, you're watching and not doing anything, and you're not training your brain. So those are the two components. And the third component is, I don't know if you did this at all, but I used to do this. And after you would go to the darts bar, go home and refine. Meaning any mistakes that you made, you jot them down, you practice them 5 times, you put them into a book, and then you're looking at them again. Or what I used to do for myself is I used to make a recording of myself first using bad Japanese. And because I didn't have anyone. And then later I would ask my friend to re-record it using proper Japanese. And now it's kind of easy to find someone. I didn't have the iPhone, so I couldn't just say, hey, can you do a quick recording? But that whatever you learned at the bar, the mistakes you make, which are powerfully remember in the brain, you don't have to jot them down right away, but when you get home, write them out and practice them again. That's that final component to refining what you do, then practicing, and then making it part of, this is a bit of an advanced tactic, but what I call a language profile. And let me give you a quick example. We talk about the feminine way. So you're kind of mimicking and you're kind of learning a bit feminine, but who's the coolest Japanese speaking guy you remember from Fukuoka? Could be one, could be two.
Yeah, there were a few guys. There was a guy called I think his name was Takashi, and I'm trying to remember. This was 9 years ago now, so I'm trying to remember. I haven't spoken to a lot of those guys in a long time, but yeah, there was one guy in particular who was like the coolest guy in the group.
And did you not want to speak like him?
I guess I did. At the time I didn't really think about it, but yeah,
there were some speakers I wanted to speak like them, so I would ask them to record. Hey, can you record? Then I would copy the way they spoke. I would use the expressions that they spoke, and I kind of started to create a bit of a language profile in Japanese. And what's cool right now about Netflix is Netflix actually dumped so much money into the translation and voiceovers that you can actually pick a character on Netflix. Then if you watch the show in English, you already understand. Then you can watch it dubbed over and with the subtitles. And you can take notes and wind up speaking much like that person you want to mimic. Have you ever seen the show The Mentalist?
I have. What's his name? Patrick something. Simon Baker. He played Simon Baker. He played the Mentalist. Yes, I remember it.
It's like one of my favorite characters. So what I do is, even now, I sometimes go refine my Japanese. I'll go watch him for his really snarky comments. And in my head, using his English, I'm translating them one way. But then when I listen to the dubbing, the voiceover, it's done a different way. So I jot that down. And then when I use it, people are like shocked.
Really?
One by the kind of, it's kind of what I'm going for among my friends, but they're kind of shocked by like that the context is perfect. It's not a literal translation from my head, and I'm being snarky, which is closer to my American personality. And so it's this fascinating way of leveraging this incredible tool and 5 other people's work, the original actor, the translator, Japanese, the English translator, and the voiceover, because you're copying the voice actor too. and you're able to leverage all that into a voice that you want to create.
Right. And it's funny that you say that, because usually I tended to avoid the sort of Japanese dramas. I find most of them quite uninteresting. And also I thought that the way Japanese people act, it's nowhere near as sophisticated, I think, as Western actors. You know, I think it's very theater like. In the way that they perform, even when they're on screen. And so what I would do is I'd watch something like, I think a good example on Netflix would be Terrace House, which is very popular. And I would watch that, and it's actually like people interacting in a normal setting. It's not some kind of drama that's scripted, that's written. Because, you know, if you think the same thing, like if you spoke the way a lot of people do in TV shows, you know, like I like the TV show Billions, but I would never speak like the characters from that show, because they all sound kind of like they spent too much time in a library. And they use all these like quotes from these like famous men or something to try and like make all of their points. Like every single point has to be made by like a famous quote from someone. And so, you know, I would never try and mimic those people, but something like Terrace House, I can copy the guys in there, and they're sort of like, some of them are like younger guys, like maybe my age or a little bit younger. That's a really good way for me to pick up, and I did that for a while when I was taking my Japanese learning very seriously.
So I think we have to back up for 1 minute, right? So, and we have to kind of take a look at something that you said, because this is like one of the things that I constantly struggle with. And there's someone out there who probably knows the right words I'm looking for. I can't believe I missed the anchor point before, but we have to take a look at kind of the construct of the way we see Japan. So if we're watching a show and it might seem simple or silly to us, is it that we don't understand that culture that deeply, or are we applying like a Western construct to it, or not just a Western, but how we grew up, individual, personal characteristics and the way we see the world, right? Because there's some really interesting things inside of this, and maybe we just weren't exposed to them, or maybe what seems simple to us is actually quite deep. And then there are times when simple is just simple, right? And silly is just silly. So it's that constant struggle, like, and maybe we just don't have enough exposure to everything that's going on. And that's why, like, sometimes I just so fascinated by flipping back and forth between, you know, the Japanese shows, listening to the English shows, listening to the Japanese. And sometimes the quotes, like, and by the way, Billions is on Netflix. I'm going to watch it now, dubbed in, and see how they deal with that. Because maybe they're going to take a big, long quote and they'll change it to something localized to a Japanese kind of
context that actually works for Japanese people, because a lot of the concepts and a lot of the ways that we express things in English, they don't work in Japanese directly. You have to change what you're saying, because, you know, it's kind of like the idea, a lot of people know this one, would be the term "otsukare sama desu." If you try to translate that into English, people will be like, wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. So you have to explain it in a way that makes sense from a cultural perspective.
Yeah, you have to take a lot of the Japanese phrases and explain them contextually, like what situation they're used to get the full translation. And what I was searching for before is this metaphor, right? Like a metaphor in English might not be translated directly. You might have to search for the appropriate metaphor, or maybe it's just silence. You know, it's so many like things going on, and that's what Netflix made. That they kind of bring a whole new dimension to this, in that you can instantly toggle between these deep concepts and see how these professionals were paid to translate them and to bring them to life in other languages. And one of the really good examples was the subtitles. And like when you're watching a Western movie, you're kind of watching and it's like, this is a terrible translation, but they're taking the context of trying to absorb what's going on visually, making it short and compact. And when you look at it from that perspective or that vantage point, all of a sudden, like, wow, okay, they're doing a really good job of making it concise. You have enough time to read, see their emotions, and etc. So.
Yeah, no, it's a really big challenge. I'm curious about some of the people that you've listened to when it comes to language learning advice. So I got really, I didn't read too much of it, but there was a guy called Krashen who talked about I think the concept was I+1. So like you should be listening to the language that you want to learn at a slightly higher level than you can understand easily. And so that kind of gives you like from context, you can learn new words. This is a lot of how children will learn their native language is by listening to their parents, and they'll like understand some of the words, and the parent will say like blah blah blah, and they'll be like, I don't know what that is, and then just from context they'll be able to learn it, and then you learn it much more strongly, much more usefully, because you've actually learned it in the target language. So who are some of the people who have influenced you in terms of the way that you not only learn languages yourself, but also what you've put into Japanese Pod 101?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. So if we go back, my background is not in linguistics. My background is actually in economics. And then when I came to Japan, I came to Japan as an English teacher, a conversational English teacher. Then this was an interesting point in my life. I found a Japanese school in the first city I came to, Hitachi City in Ibaraki. And so from 9 a.m. in the morning, I would go to Japanese school till 1 p.m. And then from 1:30 to 9 p.m. I would teach. And then from 9:30 to midnight, I'd go to the local bar. But I didn't drink. I would just stay at the bar chatting. So it was kind of interesting. And I would go into the school and I would learn very polite Japanese, like "Ohayo gozaimasu," "Genki desu ka?" How are you? Then I would go to the bar and I'd say "Genki desu ka?" And they're like, no, you just say "Genki." And I got it. And then the next day I go to school and be like, "Hey, Genki, Sensei, Genki." And the sensei like, no, you don't say that. So
right.
I found, and then I go out with my friends and it was a totally different language. So a lot of the way I approach Japanese Pod 101 was not so much from a pedagogical point of view, because I didn't really spend a lot of time on the deep academics behind learning. It was more that here I was, I learned some Japanese in the States. I learned some Japanese at a Japanese school. I learned some at the bar. I learned some with my friends. Everything's different. Like, there's got to be a way to streamline this, because the stuff I'm learning with my friends was so different than the school. So my original approach to learning and with Japanese Pod 101 was, how can I help people who are exposed just to the classroom and polite Japanese learn that there's more going on, and how can I expose them to kind of more real life or more practical stuff. Only later on did I actually go back and start to read the journals. And, I think what's fascinating about language acquisition and learning in general, a lot of the mediums have changed, but the actual processes and the pedagogy to actually learn a language hasn't really changed that much. I didn't really start out having a great deal of understanding about language acquisition. And the way I learned was more organic, just applying. And but I'm a fan of a few things. I like reading. And I remember as hard as Japanese is reading now, I'm quite the eternal optimist. I believe that things are getting easier and easier. So when I started, I had a handbook for Japanese. I had a dictionary for kanji. So I had to find the radical, which is a part of the Japanese kanji, then look it up in the dictionary, count the number of strokes, and then get the one reading. Then I'd have to rinse, wash, repeat. So if there were 4 kanji in a row, I'd have to do this 4 times. Now you have the OCR, basically you can point your cell phone at something and get the reading for a kanji. So in that aspect, this is 10 times faster.
Right.
So I like reading. I think spending time on learning how to read gives you a really good foundation into getting very, very good. And if you spend most of the time on speaking, you have a very good chance of interacting and getting very good at speaking. But in my experience, a lot of people never, ever go back. Once you can speak and function and get through your day in daily life in Japanese, rarely do people go back and put in the effort to learn how to read.
Yeah, it's funny because I think I'm similar to you, and I think we're both very different from a lot of people. Is that a lot of people really learn how to speak Japanese, and they learn, like, the ones who I know who got good, it's mostly because they've spoken a lot. But all the people I know who have a much higher level of Japanese have also spent a lot of time on kanji, and and I actually found it a lot easier to learn certain concepts, like especially when I was learning verbs, like back in the day. I found that I could remember them when in my head, I would kind of see the kanji once I knew the kanji for the verb. And I would kind of see it in my head as I was saying it, rather than thinking, what does it teach in Japanese? And then I would have to, like, in my head, go through this loop of like, okay, I want to say the word teach. Teach is oshieru, and then back to English when I'm translating whatever they've said in my head. I found it so much easier, and I had this kind of like picture in my head rather than trying to figure out what it was in English. But I want to wrap up here because we've been going for more than an hour now, and it's I could talk to you for a long time about this stuff. It's super fascinating, but I want to wrap up. So where can people find out more if they want to know more about what you do and Japanese Pod 101?
So I think the simplest way is, if you're an audio, well, these days the program has changed quite a bit, and it's quite an integrated program. One of the best things that we've added recently are testing components, so you can actually see, measure how you're doing, because one of the most important things that's taken kind of the longest time to integrate with the new medium, right? It's kind of like something new comes along and the content moves there, but it takes a little time for the actual measurement component to catch up. So we've done a pretty good job of coming along. So we started as a podcast, and now it's kind of an integrated approach. So if you want to try it out, you can try it for free. And one thing that kind of gets mixed up, if you subscribe to our feed, you can get most of the content for free for a certain period of time. So quickest way is to come to Japanese Pod 101, sign up for an account. If you have an account already, or you were a member, I think we have a coupon, Jobs in Japan, that will get you 30% off. So that can work too if you want to try it out. But give it a shot. And if it's the type of learning that works for you, excellent, because it's super flexible. We have the app, you can listen. But if it's not for you, then there are lots of other ways to learn. And as we discussed on this discussion today, as we discussed today, let me shorten that. As we discussed today, the secret to this is, 1, finding what works for you. 2, spending some time on it and making it part of your routine. And 3, refining. And if you can do that, you're going to make progress, and progress builds confidence, and then that increases your motivation. And then just focus on your anchor points, and just realize that why you started may not be why you're continuing. For example, if you started for a partner and you've been together for some time, that's no longer your reason to study. You have to find that next reason. Make it about culture, make it about music, make it about literature, make it about reading, and continually and refine, make it about friends, make it about a sports group, but continually refine why you're doing this, because every few reasons, just like life, your reasons and motivation change.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.